Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this afternoon's session. A very quick break that was, but needs must. Now, this afternoon, we're going to be discussing matter 9, which is Gypsies and Travellers and Travelling Show People Accommodation. I'm not going to do loads of introductions or any introductory sort of openings, but my name is Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors. We've got Mr. Warden as well, who are here, have been appointed to examine the soundness and legal compliance of the plan. Now, we will be having, depending on how we go on this, I'm not sure how many questions Mr. Whips may have, because I know it's Mr. Whips and the council, and I will do formal introductions in a moment. But I do have a number of questions myself. But if we do need to this afternoon, we will be having a break, usually around sort of 3:15, 3:30ish. Let's just see how it goes, and then we'll take it from there. So can I just move on to introductions then, please, because we do have a small participation list in front of me, but can I start with the council, please?
Yes, good afternoon, ma'am. Paul Shadaribian, Queen's Counsel, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Afternoon, Inspectors. My name is Andrea Pearson, Brentwood Borough Council.
Lovely, thank you. And representative for Blackmore, Hook End and Wyatts Green Parish Council, please.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is David Whips. I'm a solicitor with Holmes and Hills.
Lovely, thank you. And I know there's nobody else present in the meeting, so as it's such a small meeting. Right, thank you. So now, Mr. Whips, I am going to be, because we're not just dealing with Gypsy and Traveller accommodation from the beginning. So in terms of needs, as well as then moving on to site allocations and then moving on to the actual development management policies. So are you restricted by any time allocations? Do you want to say something first and get that element out of the way, or are you happy to sit and listen in on everything else?
I'm happy to sit and listen in, and I think it's more logical to do your questions as you go through with them. And as you know, my concern is in respect of the one allocation within Blackmore, and I will jump in when we need to, but I'll do it at the most appropriate time.
I just thought I'd ask, just in case you've got any time restrictions, but if you haven't, that's absolutely fine.
I'm sitting in my study at home. I don't have any issues. I would say that I haven't got that many questions. I would imagine we will, unless your questions to councillor are extensive, I suspect we'll get finished before the afternoon tea break. I hope that's
you're being optimistic there, Mr. Whips. Let's see how it goes, shall we?
It's in your hands.
We ought to make a bet on that, shouldn't we? If I was a gambling woman, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Shadaribian will give us the odds.
Let's get started, and then we'll see. You may well be correct that we may only just go to the before we break. So can I make a start on our the MIQs that we set out were very defined. We were looking at the identified needs, then looking at the provision provided in the plan, and then obviously turning then to the specific development management policies relating to Gypsy and Traveller and Travelling Show People accommodation. Now, in relation to the identified needs, the evidence is clearly set out in the Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment. There's a need for 12 Gypsy and Traveller pitches that's been defined in there for those individuals who meet the planning policy for traveller sites definition. And then the GTAA, as I will call it, also concludes that there's a need for 66 additional pitches for those Gypsy and Traveller households that don't meet the PPTS, the planning policy for traveller sites definition. The evidence also concludes that there's no current need for transit sites and no current need for travelling show people sites. So my understanding of that, council, that's all correct, isn't it? Yeah, I'm getting some nods, so that's good. Now, in relation to the methodology that's been used to assess the Gypsy and Traveller needs, the identified needs, etc., you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going down that route. I have no further questions. The evidence has been submitted, and I'm content with that evidence and the methodology that has been used to produce that. So I won't be asking any questions on that basis. So turning to question 122 in our MIQs. This was a question about the additional, or the needs of the 66 additional pitches. I forgot to say at the beginning, I am proposing to go through just sort of in order of our questions that are set out, because that would be easier, I think, in this instance. Now, the Council's response in relation to our question 122, and the Council's response in before that, which was set out in F5F, which was again in response to our initial questions on this issue, summarises the mechanisms to be used for the provision of accommodation for those people who don't meet the PPTS definition of Gypsy and Traveller. Now, the Council made this very clear that this is through policy HPO4 and the requirement in strategic policies to provide specialist accommodation. So it's set out in some of those specific policies and requirements. Now, I'm not proposing to look at HPO4 at this stage. We will be looking at that later. That's going to be as part of our Matter 8 discussions, which is now going to be held in mid-March. Now, policy HPO4, without going into detail about the specific wording of that policy, that supports proposals which contribute to the delivery of specialist accommodation. So I suppose my question here is how will the need for those 66 additional pitches be achieved through the implementation of that policy? I just want to have an understanding of how that would be utilised. So could the Council just explain that, please?
Sorry, there's some confusion this end as to who's taking the question, because we're all remote.
Okay, don't worry.
There's a breakdown in communication because most people are working remotely. It's supposed to be dealt with on an ad hoc basis, essentially. When proposals come forward, they will be considered. So if such a person who is not officially within the category of a gypsy or traveller as defined. So we're talking here about people whose needs must be considered, but there is no requirement actually to make provision. Those needs were considered as part of the SHMA process, and it's considered that should those persons wish to seek permission for a pitch, then they will do so through the development management policies of the plan, including HPO4.
And has that actually happened in Brentwood?
As far as I'm aware, it hasn't, but I'll ask Andrea Copsey if she wouldn't mind just clarifying that.
Yes,
she has a lot more background than I do.
Thank you.
Sorry, Inspector, can you repeat the question?
It's whether that has actually occurred. So whether an application has come forward for a gypsy and traveller who requires a pitch but doesn't meet the PPTS definition.
Not to my knowledge at this time, no.
So the approach of the plan hasn't been tested as yet, or the previous approach.
Yes, correct.
Hasn't been tested as yet. Okay. So in terms of where, I'm trying to think of where pitches may be deemed to be acceptable, thinking about the greenbelt nature of the council and its borough, and obviously taking on board that specific pitch provision isn't being provided because the council is not required to produce that. But obviously it has to take on board that this is an accommodation need, and it's a very specific accommodation need. Does the council see any particular issues in the wording of the policies in the plan in causing issues for these gypsies and travellers who don't meet the PPTS definition on coming forward? Obviously, yes, there are the greenbelt issue, because whether it's gypsies and travellers, they meet the PPTS definition, or whether or not they don't meet the definition, the greenbelt element would still be the same.
Yes, yes, it would. And so one would have to, the applicant would have to show very special circumstances. And of course, as we know, very special circumstances could admit anything of planning relevance. And it's a matter for the decision maker to determine whether or not those circumstances are very special, as a matter of fact and degree. And the inability to find accommodation is one factor that would weigh in the balance.
Okay.
There is also the possibility that windfalls sites will arise during the plan period on non-greenbelt areas, or within some allocations. So one can't discount that.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I will just ask it. Was consideration given to providing hybrid sites in relation to pitches for those that meet the definition and pitches for those that don't, within the same sort of site allocations? Was any of that? I think I know the answer to it, but it's just nice to understand the council's approach. Because the hybrid,
I'd have to ask.
Hybrid
I'd have to
sites
ask Andrew
can
Pearson
obviously be
again, I'm afraid.
come into force.
Yeah, okay.
The approach that the council took on that was to go out and do site assessments to evaluate the sites, because we do have a number of sites that currently don't have planning permission, to see their appropriateness. And so our policies have been developed to be able to make sure that we meet the needs as identified through the GTAA. And then also allow for those sites to expand within reason within the site boundary itself. But in terms of specifically looking into doing hybrid sites, we had not. Though the council did undertake 2 separate meetings with the Brentwood Gypsy and Traveller Support Group to be able to get better understanding of their needs. And based on the feedback that we got from them when we were going through our proposed policies with them, we feel that the policies do support the needs of the community.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, thank you for that. I'd now like to move on to the provision of sites then, please. Now, the plan identifies a need for the provision of 13 pitches, because that includes a pitch that's been lost through redevelopment. So the need is clearly identified and clearly defined within the plan. So I'm not going to be asking any further questions on that, as I've previously said. And in relation to the methodology for looking at sites, you've set that out, particularly in your F5F document, in response to our initial questions. You've set out that you did go down the route of call for sites. You've obviously there were no sites came in on call for sites, that's my understanding, and that you have therefore gone down a different route in terms of looking at possible sites for allocation, etc. And obviously you have your existing Gypsy and Traveller sites, which we'll come on to a little bit later. So in relation, unless anybody's got any queries in relation to the methodology that's been used, I suppose my only query is, have all other reasonable options been considered as part of that, considering site allocations, including discussions with neighbouring authorities, for instance? Have those discussions all occurred?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, they have.
Okay, thank you. I've got no further questions on the methodology that's been used, so we're going to now move on to the actual site allocations, and then before we then look at the development sort of management aspects where relevant to some of those policies. So this is specifically looking more closely at policies HPO 7 and HPO 8. Now, before we start looking at the actual policies themselves and the sites themselves, I just want to get some clarity in relation to sites that have permission, sites that have temporary permission. Some sites have, I think the vast majority of sites, of existing sites, seem to have temporary permission. But I think there is, am I correct in that there is, there are some that have permanent permission? I'm looking at Deepdale Park. That seems to, in your assessment, that seems to have permanent permission. But the rest, or the vast majority, appear to have temporary permission. Oh no, you've got Ryetch, that's got permanent. So there is a little bit of a mix, but it's the majority are temporary.
Yes, that's correct.
Is that correct? Okay. Yes. Now, in terms of if we just move on, just stay on with the site allocations. Mm-hmm. The planning policy for traveller sites clearly states that traveller sites are inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. They made that it's very clear in national policy. So, and the council is proposing to allocate sites, but proposes to keep them in the Greenbelt.
Yes, that was our original intent.
That was your original. Now, in the hearing statement, you've intimated that you may be acceptable of going down the route of taking them out of the Greenbelt.
Yes.
Because you know where I was going with those questions.
Yes.
Obviously, because I would have concerns if sites, allocated sites, were to remain in the Greenbelt, because then any planning application that came forward, very special circumstances would still have to be demonstrated, etc. So, so is the council now saying that it will put forward a modification to take those sites out of the Greenbelt?
Yes,
okay.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. We will come on to discuss, I know Mr. Whipps is waiting in the wings to discuss specific sites, so we will come on to that in a moment, Mr. Whipps. So I will come and look at specific sites. I just want to understand the principle, first of all, about allocations being within the Greenbelt. So in relation to the policy HPO 9, which is safeguarding permitted sites, Is
Yeah.
the council proposing the same approach to take those sites out of the greenbelt and inset them?
For majority of these sites, they already have temporary or personal permissions, so very special circumstances have already been demonstrated.
They have for that temporary permission, but when they apply again, they have to go through very special circumstances again.
If it requires us to take them out of the greenbelt for the purpose of being in compliance with national policy, then yes.
I'm glad to hear that. That saves a lot of discussion. So, thank you for that. Obviously, that will require changes to the policy wording on the specific site allocation policies and the safeguarding permitted sites policies, however you want to word that, because you're not really safeguarding them. They're just existing allocated sites, aren't they, within
Yes, understood.
the greenbelt? Okay, or they will be inset from the greenbelt. Okay, thank you. I think just in relation to that, though, you in your hearing statement, you state that you aren't necessarily averse to that, but that you are concerned that if these sites are no longer required for gypsies and travellers, that the land should revert back to greenbelt and there should be something set out in policy, which isn't acceptable, obviously, because it's only at the point of producing a local plan or reviewing a local plan that greenbelt boundaries can be amended, etc. And there would again need to be exceptional circumstances shown to put land in to the greenbelt as well as taking land out, etc. So that element would not be consistent with national policy. Okay, so we won't be recommending that goes in. Can I now look at can I bring in Mr. Whips? Because I know you want to specifically talk about the Gypsy and Traveller site proposed to be allocated in the Blackmore area. So do you want to just summarise your particular concerns that you have?
Yeah, particularly, Mark, I hope you're not going to pick up any background noise. I apologise if we do, but there's a roadworks going on outside my property at the moment.
Don't worry, I can hear it, but it's only in the background, so that's fine.
Okay, good, thank you. Can I, firstly, just to pick up the point you've raised, and I realise you've given some informal indications in the usual way to the council, but my clients do have some concerns about the removal of the site in Blackmore from the Greenbelt. It is a very open site. The parish council are not objecting in principle to the allocation. They recognise the need for the borough council to address the need for gypsies and travellers, and this site has been in existence for many, many years. So to that extent, but it is, and I anticipate that you will have looked at it, it is an open site surrounded by open meadowland, and therefore it does fulfil many of the functions of the Greenbelt. And we would see that planning permission being granted on that, there being very special circumstances for so doing. As Mr. Shadarivian has himself said this afternoon, it's a question of if we were looking at those where we weren't making allocation, is there a matter of planning judgment, very special circumstances. So I would be encouraging you to allow or to see sense, not only because we're granting planning permission in the Greenbelt, but also if the use should cease, it needs to revert back and will be subject to Greenbelt policies thereafter. So I do have some, on behalf of my clients, I do have some concerns there. The second point in terms of the specific policy, I mean, it makes the allocation, and as I've addressed that, the requirement is there should be a landscape framework by suitable boundary treatment, and again we support that because again, given the open nature of the site, a high quality landscaping scheme would be desirable. And our only other concern really is that this is a site with 7 pitches at the moment, and the council say that it shouldn't expand. Again, we agree with that, but I do see some conflict potentially between the precise wording of policy HO8 and the policy HP10, which does allow subdivision, which for all intents and purposes is an expansion. So I would like the policy to be made clear on that site that it's not subject to HP10, which permits expansion. Otherwise, as I say, on the one hand, the policy says that there will be expansion will not be allowed, but then policy HP 10 does go on to allow some expansion or subdivision. They're the points, Ma'am, I'd really like to make, please.
Thank you, Mr. Whips. Ms. Pearson, please.
Just to come on in terms of that point, just to give some reassurance that when the site assessments were conducted, it was also considered as to whether or not within the site boundaries the pitches could be subdivided to support additional pitches. And if you know, in the policy wording, it does say to consider. So it's not guaranteed that will actually happen. It will be based on a case-by-case basis where it is appropriate to do so that there isn't overcrowding that occurs within the identified site boundary.
Thank you. I will come on to look at the wording of the policies in a bit more detail shortly.
Would it help if I address Mr. Whip's issue about the green belt status being returned?
Mr. Shadrevian, yes, please.
If the decision is taken to remove the site from the green belt because exceptionally the need has to be met on this site, which is the case, if that use should stop, it's not possible to have a policy which anticipates whether exceptional circumstances will exist at that point in time to justify the site's return to the green belt, because it not being green belt, it will become new green belt at that point in time. So once its status as green belt is gone, for it to return to green belt, you would then at that point in time have to demonstrate exceptional circumstances. And there's no guarantee, actually, that circumstances would be exceptional at that point in time. So the plan can't anticipate what might happen later. It would have to be the subject of a review. But what one can do is, if necessary, is to firm up the allocation, make it absolutely clear that it can be used for this and no other purpose, so that should occupation cease by one particular occupier, it remains available as a pitch or as a number of pitches for other potential occupiers.
Thank you for that clarity. Mr. Whips, has that helped to just clarify the position? I understand your position in relation to you would still like to see these sites in the green belt.
Yeah, I don't seek to. You've got my points, and I'll leave it at that. But no, I mean, Mr. Shadrevian's suggestion that it could be made and used for no other purpose, it would be helpful to my clients, and also it would also ensure that if there is a turnover within the sites, they're only then reused for bona fide gypsies and other travellers.
Thank you. That would certainly be a requirement that or that we would wish to see in relation to any policy change in that wording, to ensure that the wording to say that these would be inset from the green belt, that they're only being allocated for gypsy and traveller use only. So.
We'll do that.
I mean, Mark, if I could just, I mean, my only concern in relation to expansion also is, and again, I don't want to repeat what I've already said to you, Blackmore is quite a small community with a small primary school. It is already accommodating one Gypsy and Travellers site. It doesn't want that to become too large, given pressures at the school and the like.
Thank you for that. We'll probably come on and have a look at that shortly when we have I start to go through some of the development management policies in relation to expansion, etc. So what I wanted to do, and just to clarify and understand, in relation to this point on expansion, I'm looking particularly at sites GT16 and GT17, which are the two sites that you're proposing to allocate currently under HP08. I wanted to understand the reasoning why the policies specify no expansion. To see whether that is consistent with national policy. And you point me to, in your hearing statement, paragraph 4, criterion D. And I don't understand that that point, unless I've misunderstood your hearing statement. So could the council just clarify why that wouldn't be allowed?
Apologies, Inspector. Can you just give me a moment?
Yes, no, that's fine.
Apologies, which paragraph was it from the MI?
Paragraph 4 of the PPTS.
Oh, the PPTS, apologies.
Yeah.
Let me just pull that.
Inspector, I'm wondering, generally, whilst Andrea just finds a relevant part for the more detailed aspects of answering that question, if we are slightly confusing the use of the word expansion, in the sense that I think our
that's
intention...
going to be my next issue. Is it expansion within the site allocation, or is it expansion outside the site allocation? Because that's not clear.
And I know Mr. Whipps raised that point helpfully, that perhaps when we're looking at the word expansion and subdivision, one and could be the two, they could be the same thing within the site. I think the word expansion here is being used in terms of it going outside of the site, therefore the boundary being extended to that which is not already within the boundary. But of course, the site could expand in terms of numbers with subdivision. So I think we may just need to come back to the use of the word so that we're clear about that.
I think that would provide clarity, because I wasn't quite clear as to exactly what those terms meant for GT16 and GT17. And obviously, if the sites are being inset from the green belt, and if we put that forward as a recommendation, as a main modification, then in relation to whether a site should be expanded outside of the allocation, that's something that the council consider as part of any review of a plan, or if any additional needs come forward when the GTAA is updated, etc. Yes, so that's not necessarily something that needs to be set out in policy.
Thank you, Inspector. I think with that change in mind, that clearly changes the context of us talking about expansion outside of the site. So that does cover that point. So we may just need to revisit the wording so that we're clear about that issue.
I'm happy to leave that with you, because I think it will just need a rejig of some of the wording in the policy. So thank you for that. And I know that you've put forward a recommendation to combine HPO7 and HPO8 as well. Anyway, that was a while ago. You proposed that, so I will leave that wording, you to provide that wording for me on that. at the other. Okay. Coming back to HP07 then, and the other, the site allocation that's proposed within Dunton Hills Garden Village. I would just like some clarity on that, please. And I have asked the questions about how policy HP11 applies in particular to this site. And I know that you have set out in your hearing statement and have proposed some additional changes, but I'm still a little bit confused about this one. So I think rather than me trying to work my way through it, if the council can just explain what they're trying to achieve. My understanding, if the Dunton Hills Garden Village site is accepted, and as part of that, I know at the moment you are proposing that, if that proposal includes, and as part of that proposal you're including some pitches for gypsies and travellers, that's then it becomes an allocation. Therefore, how does HP11, how would that apply to it? I know you're proposing some changes to change it to not just, it doesn't just apply to windfall sites, it applies to strategic sites, but I still don't see how it applies to that allocation. Is it more something for provision to be set out, to be clearly set out in the Dunton Hill Garden Village policies, to make that very clear? Because that's where the provision is going to be provided, rather than trying to rely on HP11, where the vast majority of the criteria, or a lot of the criteria, don't seem necessarily relevant in the way that the wording set out at the moment. And I know I'm not, I don't particularly want duplication across the plan, but I'm trying to understand. I know where the council's trying to go on this. It's trying to ensure that the pitches proposed within Dunton Hills accord with certain criteria and amenity requirements, etc., etc. But is it better to actually set that out specifically for Dunton Hills rather than rely on a generalistic policy? Because the Dunton Hills allocation is completely different to any windfall sites that may come forward, because it would be specifically produced, implemented in a certain way, as we started to hear when we started to discuss matter 6 on Dunton Hills. And of course, we'll go into this in much more detail when we come to Dunton Hills again at the end of February. So can I just understand, as I said, I think I understand why the council's trying to get HP11 involved with Dunton Hills, but I'm trying to, it just doesn't quite make sense to me. So if you can just try and just explain it to me, hopefully we'll come to a solution of some kind.
Yeah.
I think probably, sorry.
No, by all means, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't mind. Mr. Shadaravian.
Thank you. I expect that the reference to HP11 criteria doesn't imply that all of its criteria will be applicable. Clearly, it wouldn't be. So that only the relevant elements of the policy would be applicable. However, having heard what you've got to say, bearing in mind that the provision at Dunton Hills is going to be pretty bespoke in any event and rely upon other elements of those proposals coming together, it seems to me, and I think you're absolutely right, that exceptionally the Dunton Hills suite of policies ought to deal with that provision and provide the criteria with which compliance is required to make the pitches operate properly and effectively. And I have no doubt at all also that many of the criteria contained in policy HP 11, which talks about natural and environmental assets, landscape and stuff like that, will be accommodated as part of the overall master planning and landscaping approach taken at Dunton Hills. So ideally, I suppose, the reference to that provision at Dunton Hills ought to be dealt with within the parameters of those policies. It may well be that those policies deal with it adequately and may need only a little bit of tweaking in order to bring in a reference to the pitches as well as the remainder of the developments that are to take place there.
Thank you, Mr. Shudderavian. I think that's the only element. As I said, this seems to be a specific policy in relation to windfall sites.
Yep.
So sort of trying to tack on an allocation that hasn't got planning permission as yet, obviously. You may well find a way to word it so it can work. So yeah. I'm not absolutely saying that this shouldn't be referring to HP 11 for Dunton Hills site, but it just doesn't quite make sense for me at the moment. So can I leave that one with you?
You can, yeah. Either we can tweak it as it is and refer to specific criteria there, which should guide the design and master planning process, or we can include it in the suite of policies for Dunton Hills itself. So leave that one with us, and we'll consider that. But certainly, you're absolutely right. You can't just have a broad reference to HP 11. You need to be more specific about what elements of that will apply in the master planning process.
Thank you. I will leave that one with you. Let me just bring up this other document. So as we're talking about HP 11, I will go back to have a look at HP 10. But as we're talking about HP 11 now, can we just make sure that I'm clear on the purpose of this now, notwithstanding that you're going to go away and see whether it should relate to the Dunton Hills allocation or not. You're clarifying within your hearing statement in relation to Part A about, because you talk about unallocated land outside development frameworks and outside the greenbelt, etc. So you're clarifying that wording. In relation to the criteria that's set, and it's still this issue of the capacity that I have concerns about, and the restriction on not exceeding 10 pitches or plots, depending on if you're dealing with a gypsy site or a travelling show people site. I'm still not convinced by any evidence as to why there should be a restriction on the size of sites in terms of capacity, and why that should be present.
Yeah, okay, I can.
Could the council just explain your approach, please?
Yeah, the approach to that, as I mentioned previously, we had a number of meetings with the Brentwood Gypsy and Traveller Support Group to try and identify what their needs are. and undertook site assessments of the sites that currently exist within the borough. They're typically quite small in nature, where you have pockets. And looking at the Essex Design Guide under Principle 1 for Gypsy and Travellers, which is site and pitch layout, one of the things that they identify is that although pitch sizes are individual to the area, but that sites up to 15 pitches are considered well balanced in terms of for large scale sites, which we don't currently have any large scale sites within the borough. That hasn't been our history with Gypsy and Travellers, and therefore the likelihood that we would end up with a large scale site is minimal. So that's partly due to the Essex Design Guide and working with the Gypsy and Traveller community and local knowledge. We felt that it was appropriate to include that.
Mum, I wonder if I might just add to that. I understand what your concern is, notwithstanding what the evidence demonstrates, is that there's an assumption there that there should never be more than 10 pitches when we actually don't know if a site comes forward whether or not it can accommodate more. I expect we don't need criterion I, because H deals with it. It says the site is of sufficient size to accommodate the proposed number of caravans, vehicles and ancillary uses. So judgment can be exercised at development management stage as to whether or not the number of pitches being proposed is suitable for the site and the living conditions of the occupants.
Well, that was, thank you, Mr. Shadaravian. That was going to be my next point, to highlight or to ask the council where these factors could be looked at in terms of site capacity as part of this policy or any other policies that relate to amenity or living conditions, as we inspectors call it. So, and Mr. Shadaravian, you'd sort of answered my question there. It's a restriction on site size that's not set out for any other form of accommodation. So it doesn't seem fair and just that there should be a restriction based purely on site when other aspects that can be considered under other aspects of policy considerations to ensure that, and I'm not saying that any site should go over that number, it shouldn't necessarily be the case, but it shouldn't be set out in policy. And quite often Gypsies and Travellers do like to be on small sites because they're in a very much a family unit and they don't necessarily wish to mix with other family units, etc., etc. That's not always the case, but on some for some Gypsies and Travellers, that is very much the case. So I would thank you, Mr. Shadaravian, for recommending that or suggesting that be taken out. That's certainly something that we will have a look at. Thank you. So is the council content that it could deal with that aspect under other parts of the policy, as you've said, Mr. Shadaravian? Yes,
indeed.
Okay. So on a very similar vein, I'll come to policy HP 10 because I will be asking some very similar question about the subdivision in a moment, but I'll come to that in a minute. Your part B of your submitted policy.
Is this for HP 10?
I'm still on HP 11 at the moment, and then we'll come back to we'll go to HP 10. It's the wording in this element, just looking at your submitted, not considering any proposed changes that are set out or suggested changes, it's the wording there. You're saying quite rightly gypsy and traveller sites are inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, because this part of the policy relates to any sites that come forward in the Greenbelt. Any proposals in the Greenbelt would have to demonstrate they comply with national and local policy regarding development in the Greenbelt. So that's where you don't refer to very special circumstances in the policy, but you refer to national policy, so that's fine. But then you say, if through the application of such policy, provision of a just gypsy and traveller site in the Greenbelt is considered acceptable in principle, the proposed development is required to comply with the criteria set out with this policy. And I just want to understand what you mean by is considered acceptable in principle. Is that?
I think it means very special circumstances have been
That's
demonstrated.
what I thought, but it's not very clear. So if you could just say, if very special circumstances are demonstrated,
Yeah.
then, because it's almost a two-stage process, isn't it? First of all, can you demonstrate very special? And then, okay, now it needs to be in accordance with the criteria.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
we need to change those words to include reference to very special circumstances.
And then just in relation to paragraph 6.79, the supporting text, it says the policy excludes land in the Greenbelt.
We don't need that sentence either, because it's
And that talks about a
self-evident.
general presumption against inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, etc., etc. So could you just have a little look at that to make sure
Sure.
that is in accordance with national policy, please?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Thank you. And then if we can have a look at HP 10. Now you've clarified that this policy will apply to. It's not about just new sites coming forward. It applies to existing and allocated sites. That's correct, isn't it? So it would just apply to all sites. And again, it's that reasoning behind why there should be a sort of a policy setting out proposals for subdivision and setting out criteria that need to be met. And again, there's a 10 pitches specification or a maximum requirement on there. So, and there, again, there's no mention of very special circumstances in there, although obviously if these are all on, that was my note that I made before, they're now proposed to be taken out of or inset from the Greenbelt. So could the council just explain to me the reasoning behind or the purpose of HP 10 and this subdivision of pitches or plots, please?
Yeah. So when the site assessments were done of the current gypsy and traveller sites that exist within the borough, whether authorised or unauthorised, part of that assessment was to look at whether or not within the existing site boundaries, additional pitches could be added on site. So the subdivision of the pitches. And based on that assessment, it was determined that there were some sites where that could take place. However, none of the sites were big enough where more than 10 pitches could be accommodated on the site. And so that's where that 10 pitch requirement came from. However, I'm sure Mr. Shadarabian may want to come in on this at some point. If we've removed that from policy HP 11, and we're going to go based on as long as it's within the site boundary and it's reasonable and it meets the criteria to allow that, then there wouldn't be the need for the 10 pitches on the site.
Mr. Shadaravian?
It should come out. It should come
Thank
out
you.
because the safeguards are there.
Thank you.
And I expect you're going to go on to main paragraph B at the bottom of the policy as well. Again, I'm somewhat dubious as to whether it should be there at all. And I say that for this reason. Why is there a need to demonstrate? Why is there a requirement to demonstrate need when we know that there are those individuals who are travellers but don't meet the policy criteria, who could benefit from any such subdivision in years to come?
Thank you. Thank you for recognising that, Mr. Shadaravian. I do appreciate that. Again, though, I just wanted clarity. It's really it's just clarity on just the wording or the preciseness of the wording. So, it starts at, the local planning authority will consider proposals for, and you say on a case-by-case basis, which can be quite appropriate depending upon the situation itself. But I'll leave the count. You need to take out a couple of elements there anyway. So I'll just let you have a look at that.
It needs to be framed. Yeah, it needs to be framed positively.
It's just a bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, clear.
So it should be that local planning authority will grant planning, will allow the subdivision on this basis. So it's positively worded.
Thank you. And in relation to the supporting text, and you may wish to look at the supporting text on other elements of these Gypsy and Traveller site policies, 6.77 obviously would need to be changed.
Yep.
Etc. So if you can have a look at that.
Got that.
Thank you. My other questions related to HPO9, but as you are going to be considering this and looking at the alterations that we've talked about in relation to insetting these sites from the policies, then some of my questions no longer remain, particularly in relation to Part C, where you were specifying that permanent planning permissions for Gypsies and Traveller sites would be supported. Obviously, if these sites were to remain in the greenbelt, you wouldn't be able to say that because it's inappropriate development. But obviously, if these sites are taken out as inset sites, then that's a perfectly acceptable statement. Are there any other comments, Mr. Whipps, that you want to make?
No, ma'am. I mean, I've made I only have a number of small points, and I think I've made those. Say anything further would simply be repetition, which you wouldn't thank me.
Thank you. I'm just going to go through my notes. Mr. Warden, do you have anything you wish to add?
No, thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Thank you. Because we are coming to the end of this session, everybody will be pleased to hear. I'm just going to double check my notes just to make sure I haven't missed anything. No, because a lot of my questions were if the council was was trying to keep these sites within the greenbelt. So taking those out of the greenbelt or putting that as a suggestion, obviously that would be open to consultation as part of main mods moving forward. That has obviously alleviated those particular concerns. So unless there's anything further the council wants to add, I will bring this session to a close. So thank you very much for your participation, and we will see you again tomorrow morning, where we have employment and retail. So thank you very much.